Helen Carter had spent decades in a comfortable, predictable marriage until the day she met Daniel, a younger, charismatic colleague of her husband. What began as harmless conversation soon ignited something she hadn't felt in years, a spark of desire, a stirring of possibility. As their connection deepened, Helen found herself caught between the life she had built and the one she never dared to imagine. Torn by guilt, exhilaration, and a longing for something more, she was forced to confront the deepest question of all: was she willing to risk everything to rediscover herself? Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. Helen sat at the grand dining table, her fingers lightly tracing the rim of her wine glass. The soft hum of conversation filled the room as her husband, Richard, laughed heartily at something his colleague had said. The dinner party was one of many they had hosted over the years, an elegant affair, carefully orchestrated, with the usual assortment of business associates, friends, and their perfectly polished social routine. She had always taken pride in these gatherings. The way she curated the menu, set the table just so, made everyone feel at ease. But tonight, something was different. Or rather, someone. Across the table, seated comfortably in a tailored navy suit, was Daniel Carter. She had heard of him before. Richard often spoke of him, praising his sharp mind and easy charm, but tonight was the first time she had met him in person. He was younger than the rest, perhaps mid-30s, with an air of quiet confidence that set him apart. His dark hair was slightly tousled, his features striking without effort, and when he spoke, there was a warmth in his voice that made people lean in just a little closer. Helen had watched the way he engaged with those around him, attentive, yet unassuming, never needing to dominate the room. And then there was the way he looked at her. At first, she told herself she was imagining it, but as the evening went on, she caught it again, his gaze lingering just a second too long, the subtle tilt of his head when she spoke, as though he were genuinely captivated. She felt something stir in her, something she hadn't felt in a long time. Desire. It was absurd. She was 52, a married woman, a mother, a woman whose life had been neatly arranged in the way that life tends to be after decades of marriage. It wasn't as though she was unhappy. Richard was a good man, stable, reliable, devoted. Their life together was comfortable, predictable. And yet, as she sat there, watching the way Daniel's lips curved into an easy smile, she couldn't deny it. There was something intoxicating about being noticed in a way that wasn't obligatory or habitual. When had she last felt that flutter in her chest? When had someone last looked at her and seen more than just a wife, a hostess, a woman who had long settled into the background? It wasn't just attraction, it was the thrill of being seen. She forced herself to look away, focusing instead on the delicate sip of wine as Richard clapped Daniel on the back, clearly enjoying his company. The conversation had shifted to some upcoming project, something Richard was eager to involve Daniel in. Helen wasn't really listening anymore. She excused herself to the kitchen, needing a moment to breathe. The cool tiles beneath her feet grounded her as she reached for the bottle of wine, pouring herself another glass. "You throw quite the dinner party." She startled slightly at the voice behind her, turning to find Daniel leaning against the doorway. "I thank you," she said, setting the bottle down. "I suppose I've had enough practice." He chuckled, stepping further inside. "Practice or not, you make it look effortless." Helen smiled, though her hands felt oddly unsteady. "I've always believed that a good host makes sure their guests never see the effort behind the evening." Daniel tilted his head, studying her. "And yet, you still seem a little preoccupied." Her breath caught. Was she that transparent? I suppose I'm just tired. These things take more energy than they used to." He nodded, but didn't look convinced. Instead, he stepped closer, just enough for her to notice the faint scent of his cologne, something warm, with a hint of spice. "Stop this," she scolded herself. "I hope you don't mind me saying," Daniel said, his voice lowering slightly, "but I think you underestimate yourself." Helen blinked. "What do you mean?" He gave her a small, knowing smile. "It's just an observation. You seem like someone who's used to making sure everyone else is comfortable, but I wonder, when was the last time someone made you feel that way?" A slow, unfamiliar heat spread through her. She should laugh it off. She should change the subject, steer this conversation back to safer ground. But for the first time in years, she didn't want to. and that terrified her. A voice from the other room called Daniel's name, breaking the moment. He hesitated, as if waiting for her to say something, to confirm that he wasn't imagining this pull between them. But Helen said nothing. With one last lingering glance, he turned and walked away. Helen exhaled shakily, gripping the counter as if it were the only thing keeping her tethered to reality. She was a married woman. This was madness. And yet, as she listened to his footsteps fade, she knew something had shifted. For the first time in a long, long time she felt alive. Helen woke the next morning with a strange, weightless sensation in her chest, like she was balancing on the edge of something she couldn't name. The memory of last night clung to her like the scent of wine on her breath. She lay still for a moment, staring at the ceiling, trying to dismiss the quiet thrill still buzzing beneath her skin. It was ridiculous. A single conversation. A few words. A glance held for too long. That was all. And yet it wasn't. She could hear Richard moving around downstairs, probably making coffee before heading to the office. He had always been an early riser, his routines as steady as the ticking of a clock. Their life together had settled into a rhythm familiar, predictable, safe. You underestimate yourself. Daniel's words surfaced in her mind, unbidden. She inhaled sharply and forced herself out of bed, shaking off the thought. By the time she made her way downstairs, Richard was already dressed in his usual dark suit, the morning paper folded neatly beside his coffee. He looked up with a brief smile. "Morning, love. You sleep all right?" "Yes," she lied, pouring herself a cup. "How about you?" "Fine. Last night went well, don't you think?" She nodded, stirring her coffee absently. "Yes. Everyone seemed to enjoy themselves." "Daniel's a sharp one," Richard continued. "He's got a good head for business. I think he'll be moving up quickly." Helen focused on her coffee, willing herself to stay neutral. "Yes, he seems very capable." Richard took another sip. "He was asking about you, actually." Her pulse jumped. "Oh, said you have a real talent for making people feel at ease." Richard chuckled. "Told him you've always had that gift." Helen forced a smile. That was kind of him. Something in the way she said it must have caught Richard's attention, because he looked at her for a second longer than usual. But then he shrugged, already shifting back to work mode. "I'll be home late tonight," he said, standing. "Meeting ran over, so we're finishing up at the club." "All right," she murmured. He kissed her cheek, a practiced, absent-minded gesture before heading out the door. And just like that, she was alone. Helen exhaled, her fingers tightening around the coffee mug. She should be used to this. The quiet of the house, the long stretches of time where she existed in the background of Richard's life. But last night had stirred something deep inside her. She couldn't just forget. The afternoon sun filtered through the windows of the cafe, casting soft golden light over the wooden tables. Helen had intended to busy herself with errands, to fill the day with tasks that would push all unnecessary thoughts away. But instead, she found herself here lingering over an untouched cup of tea, lost in her own thoughts. The little bell above the door chimed, and when she glanced up, her breath caught. Daniel. He hadn't seen her yet, his attention on ordering at the counter. He looked slightly different outside of last night's formality, his suit replaced with a crisp, open-collared shirt and dark jeans. But the confidence, the ease with which he carried himself, was unchanged. Helen should look away. She should leave before he noticed her. But some stubborn part of her refused to move. Then he turned. For a moment, neither of them spoke. But the faintest smile touched his lips, and in that instant, Helen felt something shift between them, an unspoken acknowledgement of the moment they had shared. She watched as he picked up his coffee and walked toward her table. "Mind if I join you?" he asked. She hesitated. The right answer was yes. The smart, responsible, married woman answer was yes. But instead, she nodded. Helen hadn't meant to let him sit down. And yet, here they were. Across the small cafe table, Daniel stirred his coffee, his fingers moving with an unhurried ease. Helen forced herself to meet his gaze, trying to ignore the way her pulse quickened. "I didn't expect to see you again so soon," he said, his voice carrying that same effortless warmth she had noticed last night. She gave a small, polite smile. "Neither did I. Do you come here often?" "Sometimes," she said, glancing down at her tea. "It's quiet." He leaned back in his chair, studying her. You like quiet? Helen hesitated. She thought she did. Her life was filled with quiet dinners, quiet nights, quiet routines. But for the first time, she wondered if she had mistaken quiet for something else. I suppose I do, she answered carefully. Daniel tilted his head, as if sensing there was more beneath her words. Last night, he said. I hope I didn't overstep. Helen's breath caught. What do you mean? His gaze was steady. What I said in the kitchen, about someone making you feel comfortable. She should dismiss it, laugh it off, say it was nothing. But instead, she found herself saying, It caught me off guard, that's all. Daniel nodded, as though he had expected that answer. Good. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. Good. He chuckled. That means I wasn't wrong. Helen exhaled, shaking her head. You're very sure of yourself, aren't you? His smile softened. No, but I know when I see something real. A slow, unwelcome warmth spread through her chest. She should stand up, end this conversation before it turned into something neither of them could take back. But she didn't. Instead, she looked at him the way the light from the window cast soft shadows over his face, the way his fingers tapped idly against his coffee cup, the way he seemed completely present in this moment with her. When had she last felt that? She cleared her throat, sitting up straighter. You must be very busy. My husband says you're doing well at the firm. Daniel's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. I enjoy my work, he said. But that's not really what you want to talk about, is it? Helen opened her mouth, then closed it again. What am I doing? She was a 52-year-old married woman, sitting across from a younger man, feeling something she should not be feeling. And yet, she swallowed hard. I should go. Daniel's gaze didn't waver. Of course. She stood, reaching for her purse. He didn't stop her, didn't push, just watched her with quiet understanding. But as she turned to leave, his voice followed her. Helen! She froze. Do you want to leave? The question hung in the air between them, weighty and impossible to ignore. She should say yes. She should walk away. Instead, her fingers curled around the strap of her purse, gripping tightly. And for the first time, she didn't know the answer. Helen walked out of the cafe without looking back. The air outside was crisp, a sharp contrast to the warmth that had settled under her skin. Do you want to leave? Daniel's question followed her, looping in her mind as she made her way home. She gripped the steering wheel too tightly, her knuckles white, her breath uneven. It was absurd. She had known this man for barely a day, a handful of hours, and yet, something about him, his confidence, his unspoken understanding unsettled her in ways she wasn't prepared for. By the time she stepped through the front door of her house, she was exhausted. The quiet greeted her as it always did, wrapping around her like a familiar embrace. And yet, for the first time, it felt stifling. She wandered into the kitchen, setting her purse down. The house was immaculate, everything in its place. The clock on the wall ticked steadily. Predictable. Steady. Safe. She had always believed those things were enough. Then why did she feel like something inside her was unraveling? Later that evening, Helen stood in front of her bedroom mirror, staring at her own reflection. Her fingers traced the soft lines around her eyes, the faint creases near her lips. The signs of time, of a life well lived. She had never been one to dwell on aging. She took care of herself. She dressed well, carried herself with quiet confidence. And yet, tonight, she felt different. 4 years, she had played her role effortlessly wife, hostess, steady companion. But when Daniel had looked at her, spoken to her, she had felt something else. Something she hadn't felt in years. Not just attractive, not just acknowledged, seen. A knock at the door broke the spell. Helen! Richard's voice. Steady. Predictable. Safe. She turned quickly, shaking the thoughts from her head. Yes. Richard stepped inside, loosening his tie. Long day, he murmured, heading straight for the bathroom. She watched him move through their space, their home, their life together. The same way he always had. There was nothing wrong with it. Nothing wrong with him. Then why did she feel as if she was standing at the edge of something dangerous? She sat on the edge of the bed, exhaling slowly. This is just a moment. A passing thought. Tomorrow, she would wake up. drink her coffee, go about her day, and she would forget all about Daniel. She had to, didn't she? Helen tried. She tried to push the thoughts away, to let them dissolve into the routine of her life. She focused on the familiar rhythm of her morning's coffee brewing, the quiet hum of the news on television, Richard's brief kiss on her cheek before he left for work. She told herself it was enough, that it had always been enough. But her hand still trembled slightly when she poured her coffee. Because no matter how much she tried to suppress it, the truth remained. She hadn't forgotten Daniel. The days blurred together, each one a quiet battle between who she was and what she felt creeping in at the edges. She didn't see Daniel. Not at the cafe. Not anywhere. And yet he was there. In the way she caught herself checking her reflection more often. In the way her heartbeat stumbled when Richard mentioned the firm. In the way she felt restless in her own skin. Then, on a Thursday afternoon, her phone buzzed with a message. A number she didn't recognize. But she knew exactly who it was. Daniel, I hope I'm not overstepping, but I'd like to see you again. Helen stared at the screen, her heart slamming against her ribs. This is the moment where she could draw the line, where she could choose to forget the pull she felt toward him, to walk away before she risked more than just a few stolen glances and lingering thoughts. She should delete the message, but her fingers hovered over the keyboard, and before she could stop herself, she typed back. Helen, where? Helen wasn't sure what unsettled her more, the fact that Daniel had reached out, or the fact that she had answered. She told herself she wasn't doing anything wrong. It was just a conversation, a meeting, nothing more. And yet, as she parked her car outside the quiet, dimly lit wine bar he had chosen, her pulse betrayed her. She was nervous, not like a woman caught in something she shouldn't be doing. No, that wasn't it. Like a woman standing at the edge of something unfamiliar, something dangerous. She took a steadying breath and stepped inside. Daniel was already there, seated at a corner table. He looked up as she approached, a slow, knowing smile spreading across his lips. You came, he said, standing. Helen hesitated before sitting across from him. I did. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The low hum of conversation, the clinking of glasses, the scent of aged wine, it all settled around them like a cocoon. Then Daniel leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. Are you nervous? Helen exhaled a soft laugh. Should I be? He tilted his head slightly, considering. I think you already know the answer to that. A waiter approached, and Helen was grateful for the brief reprieve. She ordered a glass of red wine, something rich and unfamiliar, something different. Once the waiter was gone, Daniel studied her. Why did you come? Helen lifted her chin. Why did you ask me to? His lips curved at the edges. Because I wanted to see you again. She swallowed. Daniel! I know, he said gently. You don't have to say it. But he was wrong. She did have to say it. Because if she didn't, this would spiral into something neither of them could take back. This can't be anything more than this, she said firmly, even as her voice wavered slightly. Daniel nodded. I understand. But the way he looked at her, the way his fingers tapped slowly against the table, he knew she didn't fully believe her own words. And neither did he. The wine arrived, deep red and tempting. Helen took a sip, letting it linger on her tongue. I feel like I don't recognize myself, she admitted softly. Daniel leaned in slightly. Maybe you're just seeing a part of yourself that's always been there. She met his gaze, her pulse thrumming. She should leave. She should. Instead, she stayed. And in that moment, Helen realized something terrifying. She wanted to. Helen knew she should have left after that first glass of wine. Instead, she stayed for a second, and then a third. Time blurred between sips and stolen glances, between cautious words and dangerous silences. Daniel never pushed. He didn't need to. It was the way he looked at her, like she was something rare, something worth discovering. She had forgotten what that felt like. It was late when they stepped out of the bar. The night air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of rain on the horizon. Helen wrapped her arms around herself, not from the cold, but from the weight of everything unspoken. Daniel stood close, his presence undeniable. Did you regret coming? She turned toward him. The words, yes, I do, should have come easily. They didn't. Instead, she said, I don't know. Daniel studied her for a long moment. Then, with a quiet smile, he reached forward slow, deliberate, and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. His touch was fleeting, but it burned. "You should go home," he said gently. She swallowed, nodding. "I know." But she didn't move. Neither did he. Seconds stretched, a moment teetering on the edge of something neither of them could take back. And then, mercifully, Daniel stepped away. "Good night, Helen." She let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. "Good night." She turned and walked toward her car, her heart pounding. But as she gripped the steering wheel, staring at her own reflection in the windshield, she realized the truth. She had crossed an invisible line tonight, and there was no going back. Helen drove home in silence. The city lights blurred past her, casting long streaks of gold and red across the windshield. Her hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, as if holding on tightly would keep her thoughts from spiraling. She replayed the night in her head, the soft glow of the wine bar, Daniel's unwavering gaze, the way his fingers had brushed against her skin for just a moment, leaving something behind. She hadn't done anything wrong. Not really. No kisses, no confessions. But something in her chest told her this was already a betrayal. As she pulled into the driveway, she saw the lights still on in the living room. Richard was home. Her stomach tightened. She sat in the car for a long moment, forcing herself to breathe, to steady her expression, to push Daniel's voice far, far away. Then she stepped inside. Richard was on the couch, a book in his hands. His reading glasses sat low on his nose, and a half-finished cup of tea rested on the coffee table. He looked up as she entered, his face warm, familiar. "Safe. You're home late," he remarked, setting the book aside. "I was starting to wonder if I should call." Helen forced a smile. "I lost track of time." He stretched his legs, glancing at the clock. "Did you meet up with someone?" She hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. But Richard didn't notice. She thought about lying, about saying she'd met an old friend, or that she had gone shopping and stopped for a drink alone. But that would make it worse. That would mean there was something to hide. So she told a half-truth instead. "I had a drink after running some errands. Just needed a little time to myself." Richard nodded, accepting the answer easily. He had never been the jealous type, never questioned her much. He trusted her. The weight of that trust settled heavily on her chest. He yawned. "Well, I'm glad you're home. You okay?" She nodded quickly. "Of course." He smiled, kissed her on the forehead, and stretched. "I'm heading up to bed. Are you coming?" "In a bit." She waited until he was upstairs, the soft creak of their bedroom door closing behind him. Then she sat down on the couch, exhaling slowly. She should have felt relieved. Instead, she felt hollow. Helen thought she could push Daniel out of her mind. She was wrong. The next morning, she woke up with a heaviness in her chest. The scent of coffee filled the house, and she found Richard in the kitchen, already dressed for work. "Morning," he said, handing her a mug. "Morning." She took a sip, savoring the warmth, but it did nothing to steady the unease curling inside her. Richard glanced at the time. "I've got a lunch meeting today, so I'll be home later than usual. Anything planned for the day?" Helen shook her head. "Just errands." He kissed her temple. "All right. See you tonight." And then he was gone. She stood in the quiet kitchen, staring at the untouched breakfast he had made for her. Richard was a good man, a steady man. So why did she feel like she was coming apart? She reached for her phone before she could stop herself. Her fingers hovered over Daniel's number. She shouldn't, but she did. "Helen, morning." A response came almost immediately. "Daniel, I wasn't sure if I'd hear from you." Her pulse quickened. "Helen, I shouldn't have come last night." A pause. Then, "Daniel, do you regret it?" She hesitated. "Helen, I don't know." Another pause. "Daniel, then maybe you should see me again." Her breath caught. This was a mistake. She should end this now. "Helen, where?" The cafe was tucked away on a quiet street, a place neither of them were likely to run into anyone they knew. Helen sat by the window, fingers curled around a cappuccino, waiting. Daniel arrived 5 minutes later. He spotted her immediately, sliding into the seat across from her with that same quiet confidence. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he admitted. Helen exhaled. "Neither was I." He studied her for a moment. "You're thinking too much." She huffed a soft laugh. You don't know me well enough to say that. Daniel tilted his head. Don't I? Helen's fingers tensed around her cup. What is this? She asked finally. His expression remained unreadable. What do you want it to be? She frowned. That's not an answer. Daniel leaned forward slightly. Then tell me, why are you here? Helen opened her mouth, but no words came. Why was she here? Because she felt alive when he looked at her like that? Because for the first time in years, she felt seen? Because she didn't want to let go of something she knew she shouldn't be holding on to? She looked away. I don't know. Daniel's voice softened. Then stay until you do. She should leave. Instead, she stayed. And somewhere deep inside, she knew this was no longer something she could control. This was already something more. Helen returned home later than she had planned. The moment she stepped inside, the air felt heavier. Richard was home, standing in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner. You're late, he remarked, not unkindly. Everything all right? Helen forced a smile. I lost track of time. He nodded, focused on his task. I was thinking of making pasta tonight. Sound good? She watched him move through the kitchen, so at ease, so certain, so completely unaware. Guilt crept in, sharp and relentless. She walked over, wrapping her arms around his waist from behind. Richard chuckled. What's this for? I don't know, she murmured. I just appreciate you. He turned in her arms, smiling. I appreciate you too. He kissed her softly. Helen kissed him back. But as she did, she couldn't escape the truth. She wasn't thinking about him. She was thinking about Daniel. And that was the real betrayal. Helen spent the next few days avoiding Daniel's messages. She told herself she could stop this before it went too far. She told herself she could let go. But desire was a stubborn thing. By the fourth day, she found herself staring at his name on her phone again. Her heart pounded. And then, as if sensing her hesitation, a message appeared. Daniel, I miss you. Her breath hitched. 1,000 thoughts ran through her mind. She could ignore it. She could delete his number. She could end this right now. Or she could say the one thing she shouldn't say. Her fingers hovered. And then, slowly, deliberately, she typed, Helen, I miss you too. Helen read the words on her screen, I miss you too, and for a moment, she couldn't believe she had sent them. The message hung there, undeniable, irreversible. And then, Daniel, when can I see you? A shiver ran down her spine. She should have ignored it. She should have deleted his number, put her phone down, walked away. But she didn't. Her fingers trembled as she typed back. Helen, I don't know. A pause. Then, Daniel, you do. You're just afraid to say it. She clenched her jaw, torn between irritation and something dangerously close to excitement. Helen wasn't a woman who played games. She wasn't reckless. She had spent decades being careful, making the right choices, being a good wife, a good mother, a good person. So why did a single text message make her feel more alive than she had in years? She exhaled, staring at the screen for a long moment. Then, finally, Helen, tomorrow. The next morning, Helen told Richard she had errands to run. She told herself it wasn't really a lie. After all, she was going somewhere. She met Daniel at a small park just outside the city. It was secluded, quiet, far from the places they might be recognized. When she saw him waiting by a bench, hands in his pockets, that familiar pull gripped her chest. He turned to the sound of her footsteps, a slow smile spreading across his lips. I wasn't sure if you'd come, he admitted. Helen stopped a few feet away, hugging her coat tighter around herself. I almost didn't. His eyes searched hers, unreadable. But you did. A heavy silence stretched between them. Helen swallowed. I don't know what I'm doing. Daniel stepped closer. Then let me make it simple. And before she could stop him, before she could think, he reached out and touched her hand. Just a touch. But the moment their fingers met, something inside her cracked wide open. Her breath caught. Daniel didn't move. He didn't push. He just held her gaze, waiting. And in that moment, Helen knew. She wasn't standing on solid ground anymore. She was already falling. Helen spent the afternoon with Daniel. They walked through the park, talking about nothing and everything. She told herself it was innocent, that they were just talking. But every glance, every brush of their hands, every shared smile felt like an unspoken promise. By the time she finally left, the sun was beginning to set. And as she drove home, guilt curled in her stomach. Because the truth was, she hadn't wanted to leave. When she arrived home, Richard was in the kitchen, pouring himself a drink. He looked up as she walked in, his expression unreadable. "You were gone a while," he remarked. Helen set her purse down carefully. "I lost track of time." Richard studied her for a moment. Then too casually, he said, "I ran into Mark today." Helen froze. Mark was one of Richard's colleagues, one of Daniel's friends. "He mentioned seeing Daniel this afternoon," Richard continued. "Said he was out at some park." The room felt suddenly too small. Helen forced herself to stay calm. "Oh." Richard took a sip of his drink. "Yeah. Thought it was strange." He said Daniel looked distracted. Helen's pulse pounded in her ears. She swallowed. "I wouldn't know." Richard nodded, watching her. And in his gaze, she saw something she hadn't seen before. A flicker of doubt. A seed of suspicion. And just like that, the ground beneath her tilted even more. She had thought she was walking a fine line. But now she realized she was already dangerously close to the edge. Helen barely slept that night. Lying beside Richard, she stared at the ceiling, her thoughts spiraling. Every breath felt heavy. Every shift of his body beside her sent a wave of guilt crashing over her. Had he really suspected something? Or was she just imagining it? She tried to convince herself that she was overreacting. That Richard's comment about Mark and Daniel was nothing more than idle conversation. But deep down, she knew better. She was playing with fire, and sooner or later, she would get burned. The next morning, Helen moved through the house like a ghost. Richard barely spoke as he got ready for work, but there was something about his silence that unnerved her. Before leaving, he kissed her on the cheek, a routine gesture, one they had repeated thousands of times over the years. But this time, she felt his lips linger, as if he was searching for something, as if he was testing her. When the door finally closed behind him, Helen let out a shaky breath. She couldn't do this. She couldn't keep balancing on this razor's edge, pretending everything was fine while her heart was tangled in knots. She needed clarity. She needed to see Daniel. Helen met him at a cafe that afternoon. It was a reckless decision, but she no longer cared. The moment she saw him sitting at the corner table, a slow smile tugging at his lips, the tension in her chest eased, if only for a moment. He stood as she approached, his eyes searching hers. "You look beautiful," he murmured. Helen gave him a tight smile as she sat down. "I don't feel beautiful. I feel lost." Daniel frowned. "Talk to me." She hesitated, then exhaled. "Richard suspects something." Daniel leaned back slightly. "Did he say that?" "Not directly, but I can feel it. He's watching me." Daniel was silent for a long moment. Then he reached across the table, taking her hand. His touch sent a shiver down her spine. "Then we need to be careful," he said softly. Helen swallowed hard. "I don't know if I can keep doing this." Daniel's grip tightened slightly. "Doing what?" "This." She gestured vaguely between them. "Whatever this is." Daniel studied her. Then, quietly, "I think you do know." Helen looked away, her heart pounding. She hated that he could see through her so easily. Because he was right. She did know. She just didn't know if she was brave enough to admit it. That night, Helen sat in the dimly lit living room, a glass of wine in her hand. Richard was working late. The house was silent, and she felt like a stranger in it. This home, this life had once been everything she wanted. But now, it felt like a carefully constructed illusion. And the longer she stared at the walls around her, the more she felt them closing in. A part of her longed to confess everything to Richard, to tell him about Daniel, about the feelings she couldn't control. But what would that accomplish? It would destroy everything. And despite the turmoil inside her, she wasn't sure she was ready for that. So instead, she poured herself another glass of wine. And she waited for Richard to come home, waited for the moment when everything might finally unravel. Because deep down she knew it was only a matter of time. Helen awoke to the sound of Richard moving around the bedroom. She squinted against the early morning light filtering through the curtains, watching as he buttoned his shirt with slow, methodical movements. 4 years, she had woken up beside this man, yet today he felt like a stranger. Or maybe she was the stranger. Richard glanced at her through the mirror, his expression unreadable. You were up late last night. Helen sat up slowly, pushing the covers off. Couldn't sleep. A pause. Then, you've been having trouble sleeping a lot lately. Her pulse quickened, but she forced a small, casual shrug. Just stress. Richard turned fully to face her. From what? Helen hesitated. Life. Getting older. The usual things. He studied her for a moment, then nodded, as if accepting her answer. But the way he lingered, the way his eyes flickered over her face, it sent a chill through her. He wasn't convinced. She forced a smile. Don't you have a meeting this morning? Richard checked his watch. Yeah, I should go. He crossed the room and kissed her forehead, gentle, familiar. But as he pulled away, his fingers briefly rested on her chin, tilting her face up. Helen barely breathed. Get some rest, he murmured. Then, just like that, he was gone. But his touch still burned on her skin. And as the door closed behind him, Helen collapsed against the pillows, pressing her hands to her face. She was slipping, and Richard knew it. Helen didn't reach out to Daniel that day. She wanted to, desperately. But instead, she spent the morning wandering through the house, moving from room to room like a ghost. Every photograph, every carefully arranged piece of furniture, this was a life she had built. A life she was betraying. Her hands clenched into fists. She had to stop. She would stop. But then her phone buzzed, and all her resolve shattered. Daniel, are you thinking about me? Helen stared at the message, her heart pounding. And then, before she could stop herself, she responded. Helen, yes. A moment later. Daniel, let's meet. Helen closed her eyes. She was already lost. They met in a quiet, tucked-away restaurant outside the city. Helen had chosen the place. It was discreet, safe. She told herself it was just lunch. A conversation. Nothing more. But the moment she saw him sitting there, waiting for her, that fragile lie crumbled. Daniel stood as she approached, his smile easy, his eyes warm. I wasn't sure you'd come. Helen swallowed. Neither was I. They sat. For the first few minutes, it was light conversation. Safe topics. But then, Daniel leaned forward, his voice low. Tell me why you're really here. Helen's breath caught. She looked down at her hands, twisting her wedding ring absently. And then, barely above a whisper, I don't know how to stop. Daniel exhaled slowly, his gaze never leaving her. Maybe you don't want to. Helen flinched. That's not true. Daniel tilted his head. Isn't it? Silence. Helen wanted to argue, to deny, but she couldn't, because he was right, and that terrified her. By the time she got home, the sun was setting. She stepped inside, heart still racing from the afternoon. And then she froze. Richard was sitting in the living room, waiting. His eyes met hers, and for a split second, Helen's stomach dropped. There was something in his expression, something cold. I thought you were working late, she said carefully, setting her purse down. Richard swirled the drink in his hand. Plans changed. Helen nodded, forcing herself to move, to act normal. Where were you? He asked, voice casual. Too casual. Helen's fingers tightened on the back of the couch. Out. Running errands. Richard's lips curled just slightly. You've been doing a lot of that lately. Her pulse thundered in her ears. I just needed some air. A beat of silence. Then, Richard leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. Are you sure that's all you needed? Helen's breath hitched. He knew. Or at least he suspected. And suddenly, the walls of her perfect, predictable life felt like they were closing in. Helen stood frozen in the doorway, Richard's words hanging in the air like a thick fog. Are you sure that's all you needed? Her heartbeat pounded in her ears, drowning out the distant hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock on the wall. She forced herself to breathe, to stay calm, to lie. Her voice caught, too tight, too uncertain. She swallowed, steadied herself. Of course. What else would I need? Richard tilted his head, watching her the way a predator watches prey. I don't know, Helen. You tell me. A chill ran down her spine. She had always been good at keeping things together, at playing her role. But now, standing under her husband's piercing gaze, she felt like a house of cards on the verge of collapse. She forced a smile. You're acting strange, Richard. Richard let out a short, humorless laugh and leaned back against the couch. Am I? He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, his eyes never leaving hers. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them stretched, taut and brittle. Then softly, You used to tell me everything. Helen's breath caught in her throat. The words weren't an accusation. They weren't angry. They were sad. A crack formed in her carefully constructed walls. She opened her mouth, then closed it. What could she say? That she still loved him? That she wished things were different? That she had spent the past few months slipping further and further into something she didn't recognize? Something she couldn't control? Richard exhaled, shaking his head as if disappointed in himself. I must be imagining things, he muttered, standing up. Helen nearly collapsed with relief. He didn't know for sure. Not yet. And as long as he didn't know, there was still time to fix this. To stop. To put everything back where it belonged. Right. That night, Helen stood in front of the bathroom mirror, staring at her own face. She looked different. Not physically, her features were the same, her hair slightly tousled from the day. But there was something in her eyes. A guilt. A hunger. A fear. She pressed her hands against the cool porcelain sink, inhaling sharply. This has to end. She couldn't keep doing this to Richard, to herself, to the life she had built. She reached for her phone, her fingers trembling as she typed out the message. Helen, we can't see each other anymore. She hovered over the send button. Her heart screamed at her to delete it. Her mind whispered that it was the only way. She took a shaky breath and pressed send. Seconds passed. Her phone buzzed almost immediately. Daniel, are you sure? No. She wasn't sure of anything. But she had to try. Helen, yes. Another pause. Then, Daniel, if that's what you want. The word sat there, cold and distant. Helen felt a lump rise in her throat. This was what she had to do. Then why did it feel like she had just lost something she would never get back? The next few days were unbearable. Helen threw herself into routine cleaning, organizing, cooking elaborate meals. Richard seemed to buy it. He didn't press her any further. He kissed her goodnight, told her about his day, let things slip back into their familiar rhythm. But something between them had changed. The distance wasn't physical. It was something deeper, something unspoken. And Helen wasn't sure if it would ever go away. She thought she had made the right decision. She hoped she had made the right decision. But late at night, as she lay awake beside her husband, staring at the ceiling, she couldn't help but wonder if she had just let go of the one thing that had made her feel alive again. Helen had expected the ache to fade with time. She had told herself that ending things with Daniel was necessary, that her life would return to normal. But as the days stretched into weeks, the emptiness inside her only deepened. She felt like a ghost in her own home. Richard still kissed her goodbye in the mornings, still held her hand in the evenings when they watched TV together. But there was a weight between them, an invisible wall built from unspoken doubts and half-hearted smiles. And Helen was exhausted from pretending. She missed Daniel, more than she had expected, more than she should. She missed the way his eyes lit up when he talked about his passions, the warmth in his voice when he said her name. She missed the way he made her feel like a woman who was wanted. Now, she felt like a woman who had lost herself, and she wasn't sure how to find her way back. It had been 3 weeks since she had last seen Daniel. 3 weeks of silence. 3 weeks of convincing herself that this was the right path. Then, one afternoon, she saw him again. It was unintentional. A cruel trick of fate. Helen had been running errands, mindlessly going through the motions, picking up groceries, stopping by the dry cleaners. And then, at the corner cafe, she saw him, sitting by the window, laughing, with another woman. Helen's breath hitched. She hadn't expected it to hurt, but it did. She had no claim over him. She had been the one to walk away. And yet, the sight of him leaning close to someone else, his eyes crinkling in that effortless way that had once made her feel special, it was unbearable. She turned quickly, her heart pounding, but before she could slip away unnoticed. Helen! His voice cut through the noise of a street like a blade. She froze. Slowly, reluctantly, she turned back. Daniel was already on his feet, stepping away from his table. The woman he had been with glanced between them before looking down at her phone, giving them space. Helen forced a smile. Daniel. What? What could she possibly say? I didn't expect to see you. I miss you. I regret everything. Before she could settle on the right words, Daniel spoke first. You look good. He said it cautiously, as if testing the waters. She almost laughed at the absurdity of it. She didn't look good. She hadn't slept well in weeks. She had lost weight. She felt like a frayed thread barely holding itself together. But she appreciated the kindness in his voice. And you look, she hesitated, her eyes flicking to the woman still sitting at the table. He followed her gaze. She's a friend. He said it casually, but Helen heard the carefulness in his tone. It shouldn't have mattered, but it did. And suddenly, she hated herself for caring. I should go, she murmured. Daniel's expression flickered something like disappointment, maybe. Helen! His voice was softer now, like a plea. She looked at him, taking in every detail, the familiar warmth in his eyes, the quiet intensity in the way he watched her. For a moment, she wanted to tell him everything. That she missed him, that she regretted walking away, that she had spent every night thinking of him. But she couldn't. Instead, she nodded. It was good to see you, Daniel. And before she could change her mind, before she could let herself break, she turned and walked away. That night, Helen lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. Richard was sleeping beside her, his breathing slow and steady. She should have felt at peace. She had her life back, her stable, predictable life. And yet, she felt more lost than ever. Seeing Daniel had torn open a wound she had been desperately trying to ignore. She had thought she could move on. She had thought she could forget. But she couldn't. Not when every part of her still ached for him. Tears burned at the corners of her eyes. What had she done? Had she made the wrong choice? And if she had, was it too late to undo it? Helen woke up before dawn, her mind still tangled in the events of the previous day. She had barely slept. The image of Daniel, sitting by the cafe window, laughing with another woman, was burned into her memory. She had told herself she would move on. She had told herself she had done the right thing. So why did she feel like she was suffocating? She turned to look at Richard, still sleeping peacefully beside her. For years, this had been enough. The quiet love, the stability, the routine. But now, all she could feel was the weight of what was missing. She slipped out of bed, careful not to wake him, and wrapped herself in her robe. She needed air. She needed to think. Helen made it to the kitchen before she even realized what she was doing. Her hands trembled as she reached for her phone. She shouldn't call him. It was too late, but her fingers had a mind of their own. She scrolled through her contacts until she found his name. Daniel. Her thumb hovered over the call button. Would he even answer? She had been the one to push him away. She had been the one to walk away. But before she could talk herself out of it, she pressed the button. The phone rang once. Twice. Then, Helen! His voice was thick with sleep, groggy but instantly alert. She closed her eyes, the sound of his voice sending a shiver through her. She had missed this. She had missed him. I shouldn't have called, she whispered. Daniel was silent for a moment. Then softly, why did you? She swallowed hard. Because she couldn't stop thinking about him. Because seeing him with someone else had nearly broken her. Because she was losing herself in a life that no longer felt like her own. I don't know, she admitted. Another pause. Then quieter, more hesitant. Do you want me to come over? Her breath caught. 100 answers raced through her mind. Yes. No. I don't know what I want. But before she could speak, she heard a shift from the hallway. She turned. Richard was standing there. He was barefoot, his hair slightly disheveled from sleep, his robe loosely tied. And he was staring at her, at the phone in her hand, at the way her body was tense, caught between two worlds. Helen felt her stomach drop. Who are you talking to? Richard's voice was steady, but there was something in his eyes, a quiet pain. She had never been good at lying. And maybe she was just tired of lying. She lowered the phone from her ear. Richard's gaze flicked to the screen, just in time to see the name. Daniel. A long silence stretched between them. For the first time in their marriage, Helen saw something crack in Richard's expression. Not anger, not betrayal, but hurt. Deep, quiet, aching hurt. I see, he said softly. Helen felt her throat tighten. Richard, Do you love him? The question landed like a blow. Helen opened her mouth, but no words came out. Did she? Was it love? Or was it something else, something dangerous, something fleeting? Richard exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his face. He looked exhausted, like a man who had been fighting for something without realizing the battle had already been lost. Finally, he nodded. You should go. Helen blinked. What? Richard swallowed hard, his voice rough with emotion. I don't think I can. I don't think I want to hold you here if this isn't what you want. Tears burned behind her eyes. I don't know what I want, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard's eyes met hers, and for the first time in years, they felt like strangers. Then maybe it's time you figure it out. Silence. Heavy. Unbearable. Helen gripped the counter behind her to steady herself. She had never imagined this moment. Never imagined a day where Richard would tell her to leave. But wasn't this what she had been afraid of all along? That one day, she would have to make a choice. And now, she had no choice left to make. Helen packed a bag in silence. She didn't know where she was going. She only knew she couldn't stay. Richard didn't say another word as she moved through the house, gathering the essentials. He just stood there watching. And for the first time in a long time, she saw him for what he truly was. A good man. A kind man. A man she had once loved with all her heart. Maybe she still did. But sometimes, love wasn't enough. And sometimes, the hardest thing in the world was letting go. She stopped by the door, her fingers tightening around the handle. She wanted to say something. She wanted to explain. But what was there left to say? So instead, she whispered, I'm sorry. And then, before she could change her mind, she walked out, into the night, into the unknown, and into whatever came next. Helen sat behind the wheel of her car, gripping the steering wheel as though it were the only thing keeping her grounded. She had driven aimlessly for an hour. Streetlights blurred past her. The city, once so familiar, felt different now, strange and uncertain, like her own life. She pulled into a quiet parking lot by the waterfront. The waves rolled in and out, steady, relentless. She had no idea where to go. Home wasn't an option. And Daniel, she wasn't sure if she was running to him or from him. A deep sigh escaped her lips. She had spent decades building a life with Richard, a life that had been safe, predictable, steady. And now all of it was gone. Or rather, she had walked away from it. Her phone vibrated on the passenger seat. Daniel. She hesitated. Was she ready for this? She picked up, pressing the phone to her ear. You're calling late, she said, attempting a lightness she didn't feel. You called me first, he reminded her. Helen exhaled. I know. A pause. Where are you? He asked. By the water. Another silence. Then carefully. Are you okay? She didn't know how to answer that. She wasn't okay. She wasn't shattered either. She was in between. I left, she said finally. She heard the sharp intake of breath on the other end. Richard knows. Yes. More silence. Then softer. What now? Helen closed her eyes. That was the question, wasn't it? What now? Where did she go from here? What was she even looking for? She had left Richard because she couldn't keep living a lie. But did that mean she was meant to be with Daniel? Or had this all been about something else, something deeper? Her own rediscovery. Her own truth. I don't know yet, she admitted. And for the first time, that answer didn't terrify her. Daniel met her by the waterfront an hour later. She spotted him before he saw her hands in his pockets, wind ruffling his dark hair, his eyes scanning the shore. She had always been drawn to him. His energy, his charm, his ability to make her feel alive. But tonight, she wasn't sure what she felt. When he finally saw her, his face softened. Hey! Helen managed a small smile. They stood in silence, listening to the waves. Then Daniel turned to her, his expression unreadable. So what happens now? She studied him, and suddenly she saw it. The same uncertainty she felt. The same fear. The same weight of the unknown. And in that moment, she realized Daniel had been an escape, a spark in the darkness, a reminder that she was still here, still breathing, still capable of wanting more. But he wasn't her destination, and maybe he never had been. Helen swallowed hard. I think I need time, she said, her voice quiet but firm. Daniel's jaw tensed. He nodded slowly. "I get it," he said, though his voice held something bittersweet. Helen reached for his hand, squeezing gently. "I don't regret meeting you." A small smile touched his lips. "Neither do I." And just like that, she knew. She knew that this wasn't about choosing between two men. It was about choosing herself. For the first time in her life, Helen found a small apartment in the city, a place of her own. It wasn't much, but it was hers. She spent her days walking through old bookstores, sitting in cafes with no one to answer to, rediscovering the things she had long forgotten about herself. Some nights were hard, lonely. Some nights she missed Richard. Some nights she missed Daniel. But mostly, she was learning to be alone. And learning that alone didn't have to mean lost. One evening, months later, her phone buzzed with an unknown number. She almost ignored it, but something made her pick up. "Helen!" The voice was familiar. Soft. Careful. Her breath caught. "Richard!" A pause. Then, quietly, "I hope you're doing okay." She closed her eyes, a tear slipping down her cheek. And she smiled, because for the first time in a long time, she really was